How much time needs to pass before grave robbing turns into archaeology? Please Google Kennewick Man. Could be thousands of years depending on the relatives. I actually had to look this up once for reasons. It's 100 years or when the deceased has no remaining living relatives. Whichever comes first. Like 20 minutes. I guess you can say the answer, greater than, is buried somewhere in this thread. If you're opening the grave to make money, you're a grave robber. If you're spending money to open it, you're an archaeologist. As an archaeologist, I think this is a very weird question. It isn't time, it is intent. Grave robbing is to plunder the grave for valuables. Excavating an archaeological site is to learn. I usually wait for the family to leave, until all the living relatives at the time of death are dead. But then there's the obvious problem of only children with no children themselves with few relatives. So IDK. It's not a question of time, but rather a question of hats. You could also be a grave robber of prehistoric artifacts. Archaeology is dedicated to preserving the finds and putting them into the right historical context. Grave robbers just want money. Depends how many guns the people who have a problem with it have. Depends which side of the gunboat you're on. Well, at least it did. Since archaeology is for the purpose of discovering the past, and not for personal profit, I'd say they are never the same thing. If you take notes, it's science. If you don't, it's just fucking around. I'm not sure, but I can tell you for certain that it's generally frowned upon if you start before the funeral is over. Archaeology is just grave robbing with extra steps. This is a loaded question. Archaeology is not grave robbing. It's like equating medical doctors with Dr. Mengele. Mengele may have had a medical degree, but he wasn't interested in medicine. According to my lawyer, more than one day. If you get paid before you dig, archaeology. Get paid after you dig, grave robbing. Source: I'm disgraced archaeologist. The first rule of archaeology: it belongs in a museum. It belongs in a museum. Turns out my house is a museum. I'm not sure, but my urn is going to be full of spring snakes. This should explain it. https://www.youtube.com/watch v=yxypvhiskrq. Don't think it's about time. More so about intentions. Like last week when I dug up some rich dead guy. It was about his watch. Nothing to do with archaeology. And #X2MOB, grave robbers do it for the profit while archaeologists do it to preserve the past. One religion. About 10 or so years. It's not about the time. If you open a grave and say, "This belongs in a museum," you're doing archaeology. Punching Nazis is also acceptable. 141 years. That was the time from when President Zachary Taylor was buried, to when he was dug up to ascertain his cause of death. once all the good stuff has been looted. None if you're sneaky enough. I'd say about 10 minutes. None if you're bold enough. If the items found are just used for personal enrichment, it's never archaeology. Archaeology isn't defined by time. Police use forensic archaeologists for all sorts of recent crimes. Depends on the country. Most have an antiquities law stating when something becomes archaeological. Here in Israel it's 1700, but the US is ridiculously young because of its age. Long enough for none of the family to recognize or miss them. At least one pandemic. I think that the professional standard is not so much time, but whether you shout, "It belongs in a museum," before punching a Nazi on a boat in a hurricane. It's not so much about time as it is about credentials. Lots of people robbed the pharaohs past archaeology times. Good question. Depends on the body. It's not about time. It depends on how does it. As long as you have permission by your government, it's called archaeology. Otherwise it's grave robbery, even if it's sometimes the same thing. Indiana Jones said it best, "This belongs in a museum." Quote, I think you have to wait for the grave to be backfilled. 6. Enough time for people to realize that artifacts have historical and cultural value that should outweigh their potential monetary value. Planning something? If you yell, "This belongs in a museum," it's archaeology. If not grave robbing. A whip helps but is not necessary. Enough time for culture to change significantly, I would say about a few thousand years at the most. Well, I can certainly tell you it's more than a week. It just needs to be a different culture. Enough times need to pass that there are no living descendant within 3 generations that know who the hell is buried there. End communication. Asking for a friend. This has been asked before and it obviously depends not on the time, but on the legality and purpose of the excavation. When there's nobody alive to get upset. Replace time with money, and we'll have ourselves a nice conversation, Dr. Jones. A shift from 2 letter years, BC to AD, and AD to AC, Anno Corona. As long as it takes to forget about the person. 2 more days, crossed fingers. I believe IFRS guidelines say 20 years. Why? Who's digging? None. Well, that's what I told the police. According to our history memes, it's 20 years. Don't forget to share, like and subscribe for more content.